everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee, and we want to welcome you all to a very special episode. But before we dive into today's episode, I'm sure that each and every one of us are excited about what's coming up tomorrow, Thanksgiving. And when we hear that word, we typically think of good food, time spent with family, or, well, some of you might think of the annual WWE SmackDown that ensues when certain family members get together. But suffice it to say, the word Thanksgiving means so much more than that. It especially meant more than that to the European settlers in the New World. But that raises a series of important questions. Were the Pilgrims the first ones to celebrate Thanksgiving? If not, who was? And is the story of the traditional Thanksgiving here in America as truthful as we've been taught? Well, to find out all these answers and more, you'll have to stay tuned to this episode. Now, when we hear the word or the name of the holiday Thanksgiving, we typically think of the sensational account, the romanticized version, which talks about how the Pilgrims celebrated a 3-day harvest feast with the Wampanoag Indians. But over time, some questions have been raised about the authenticity and truthfulness of that story. And even in recent years, certain scholars have begun to produce documentation to the contrary as to, is that story as true as we've been told? And also, was it the first Thanksgiving or not? So we're going to dive into some of this documentation. The first account of which comes to us from the journal of Captain John Smith in the colony of Virginia. And he recorded that the Powhatan people, or the natives, actually celebrated 2 harvest festivals. And they were able to accomplish this due to the fact of the matter that, at least with their calendar, they had added on a 5th season. So the regular fall harvest would be celebrated in the fall, and then between the late summer and just before the regular fall harvest was taken in, they would celebrate the harvesting of their corn. Now, although this does sound like a Thanksgiving of sorts, a lot of scholars, especially lately in Florida, have bypassed all of this, and they make the claim that the first Thanksgiving was Spanish, and it was held in 1513 when Juan Ponce de Leon arrived on the coast of Florida and gave thanks to God for his safe arrival. But this really doesn't strike us as Thanksgiving as we know it today, and more than that, that's not really a cut above what other people were doing. The 16th century Spaniards were very religious, devoutly Catholic, and they would have been giving thanks and praise to God on a number of occasions. Well, if this is not the first Thanksgiving, then what is? Well, interestingly enough, just before Pedro Menendez de Avil came to America in 1565 and established the colony or settlement of St. Augustine in Florida, there were the French Huguenot settlers who escaped from France from persecution and established a colony or settlement in the northern part of Florida as a base from which to attack Spanish shipping. And it was there that they said they gave thanks unto God and sing psalms of praise. But the next year after, when St. Augustine had been established, the Spaniards attacked the French settlement and drove them out of the region. So possibly the French didn't have too much to be thankful for in that case. However, when we look forward past the 1500s, we see that the first mention of an English Thanksgiving comes to us in the year of 1619, when the Berkeley Hundred Plantation was to be established by members of the London Company. And right before they set sail in September of 1619, the captain was given orders and instructions on where to locate and how to locate a good place for settlement, as well as to make sure to give thanks to God for your safe passage upon your arrival. And thus they set sail from England, arriving off the coast of Virginia in November of 1619, before heading down to the colony of Jamestown to register themselves at port on December 4th. From there they proceeded about 30 miles up the James River to establish the Berkeley Hundred Plantation. Now, whether or not they actually followed those instructions and held the day as a holy, venerated day, a day of Thanksgiving as it were, we don't know, because even if they did, it was not documented. And so we flash forward to the English Thanksgiving that everybody knows and loves, as it were. Now, over time, as I'm sure some of you more scholarly-minded people have probably already guessed or just outright know, the story of the first American Thanksgiving, has been greatly misconstrued over time, and in fact, some of the statements that we take as actual facts today are outright wrong. For starters, these pilgrims that we've been mentioning throughout the length of this video would not have been called pilgrims. Rather, they were known as separatists, a branch of the English Puritans. And King James I hated these Puritans and began persecuting them, which led them to flee England and set up a colony in Holland. But because they were afraid of losing their religious and communal identity, they went back to England to petition James I for a grant of land upon which they could establish a settlement and a new church and, as they put it, worship God in the way they pleased. And they promised the king that they would fish once they arrived in the New World in order to pay off the cost of that voyage. And so they set sail from England, because James I was only too happy to get them out of his hair. And then they arrived off the coast of the New World at Cape Cod in November of 1620. And when they arrived, a party of young men was sent ashore in order to try and scout out the land and see about the natural resources, fish included, which could be captured and harvested in order to pay off their debt. The problem was, these separatists really didn't know how to fish, so we're not really sure how they actually intended to pay off that debt. But we also see that starvation began to become a problem while they were at Cape Cod. And this led to the settlers actually going through and robbing graves, old village sites, and stealing food and clothes out from there just so they could have a chance to stay warm and survive. And finally, as they were at Cape Cod, they had their first hostile encounter with the natives in that region, which drove them from the shores. And thus, they moved elsewhere up the coast and finally arrived at New Plymouth. However, it was in the dead of winter, and it was brutally cold, and there was no one there to even so much as greet them. And they found themselves standing alone in what they deemed to be a vast wilderness, facing off against the hostilities which only nature can provide. And in fact, although they went straight away to work, the poor living conditions were so bad that before winter's end, there were 44 dead. And just when it seemed that the settlement was on its last legs, a Wampanoag brave strode into the village, much to the amazement of everyone, and surprised them when he spoke in perfect English, saying, "Have you got any beer? Have you got any bread?" Words that he had learned from another particular native who will come into the story very shortly. Now, the separatist settlers were surprised that this man could come and speak English, but what impressed them even more was the fact that he said his name was Samoset, and he was an envoy of Chief Massasoit, who owned these lands, the lands upon which the Patuxet village had previously been. Unfortunately, the Patuxet village was wiped out due to European diseases. But he said that Chief Massasoit had been watching them intently, with great interest, to which the separatists replied that they were merely there interested in trading and possible settlement. And so Samoset returned to his village, and 5 days later he arrived not only with the chieftain of the Wampanoag, but he also arrived with a brave named Tisquantum. We call him Squanto today. And Squanto was the one who had actually taught the Wampanoags the English language, because he, a Patuxet, had been captured by European tradesmen, and while he was in slavery across the ocean, he learned how to speak perfect English. But before Massasoit decided to come into the village to talk terms of trade and settlement with the Europeans, he would not be satisfied until Edward Winslow made a hostage of himself and surrendered himself to the Wampanoag braves that were present. And thus, now feeling that he could trust the separatist, he strode into the village, and there they hammered out a peace treaty between the two parties. And one of the terms of that treaty was that Tisquantum would actually be left behind to teach the Europeans how to hunt, fish, and of course how to plant and harvest the crops native to the region. Now, after this, folks, this ensues the one good part of the story that we all know and love, because after the harvest festival, or after the harvest was brought in, we see that there was a harvest festival that went on for 3 days between the Separatists and the Wampanoags. 3 days of feasting, carousing, and just enjoying themselves overall. Now, if you want to learn more about what happens after the idyllic scene of the first Thanksgiving, well, let me know in the comments down below, because there's a lot more to the story that we're not told. However, we're just focusing on the holiday today. Now, interestingly enough, although we call this the first Thanksgiving, the term Thanksgiving would not have been used by the Separatists to denote this feast or festival that they held. In fact, for the Separatists or the Puritans, a day of Thanksgiving was a day of fasting and giving thanks to God. So it would not have applied to this festival that they held with the Wampanoags. And in fact, Edward Winslow, in his journal, makes mention that what they celebrated was more akin to an English harvest festival, and no mention of thanks to God or anyone was made, and no religious observances were taken. So if this is not our Thanksgiving, then where in the world does the idea of combining faith, food, family, and fun come into the American culture? Well, the first steps that really started to be taken towards the Thanksgiving that we all know and love today began on October 3rd, 1863, when, buoyed by the success of the Union Army at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed that November 26th should be a national holiday of thanksgiving to God, and that following thereafter, every fourth Thursday of the month should be held in observance. And since then, only 2 presidents have tried to actually change the day upon which we celebrate this holiday, most notably of which was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who changed the holiday from the 4th to the 3rd Thursday of the month of November between the years of 1939 and 1940 in order to ensure that Depression-era merchants could have more days to sell their wares and merchandise before Christmas came just around the corner. However, this bit of legislation met with some pretty stiff resistance, because that meant that now they had to reschedule all these Thanksgiving-type events, which we just commonly accept as part of the culture today, such as Thanksgiving Day parades, and of course, who could forget football games? But finally, in 1941, legislation went and undid what FDR did, and in 1941, they put it back as a law that has not been changed to this day, that every 4th Thursday of the month of November should be held in observance as the national holiday of Thanksgiving. So there you have it, folks, the history of Thanksgiving in America. Now, it's interesting what we've discussed, and quite frankly, I myself am a little befuddled as to how we should celebrate it, and also as to what I should exactly believe. But then again, it really doesn't matter. It's up to you. If you believe that the first Thanksgiving was celebrated by the natives, the Spanish, the French, or by the English in either Berkeley or Plymouth, well, that's up to you, folks. But what's the most important of all is that when you do celebrate Thanksgiving, make sure to really celebrate it. And when I say that, I see too many people get together just for the food, and they don't take the time to realize what matters the most. The food's great, but the time spent with family is better. Because it's that time spent with family that establish these holiday memories that we all come to know and love and look fondly upon in our later years. But folks, I know the holiday's just around the corner. You got turkey to eat, and then you got Black Friday shopping coming up, so I won't take up any more time out of your day. But I do want to say, next week we're going to have another video. It's going to be uploaded on Friday this time. We're going to get back to our regular schedule. But when we start the month of December, I want you to hang on, because it's going to be a bumpy ride. Or should it be a sleigh ride? Because all the episodes for the month of December, without giving too much away, are going to be based upon historical Christmas traditions and their origins. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I highly encourage you to stay tuned. And in the spirit of Thanksgiving, we want to say, folks, we are truly thankful for all the support that you show on Facebook and YouTube. It does not go unnoticed. And if you like what we're doing, especially if you follow us on YouTube, then you can click like, share, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when we upload a new episode. But I seem to be running my mouth, and so I'm going to go ahead and shut it until tomorrow when I can open it up to put some turkey in there. But until then, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum, signing off for now, saying goodbye, God bless, and have a happy Thanksgiving.